Now I've subtitled this England's Break from Rome. Rome meaning here not the city of Rome so much as the Church of Rome. The Church of Rome is which church? The Catholic Church. Thank you. As a member of a Catholic university, you should all know that. The Church of Rome is the Catholic Church. You can know that because the leader of the Catholic Church is and of course in Japanese that's the Romaho. Okay, the Pope is the Romaho. Okay, so the Church of Rome, when I talk about Rome here, I'm talking about the Church of Rome, and the leader of the Church of Rome is the Pope, and Henry is particularly famous for having a fight with the Pope, a quarrel with the Pope, and breaking away from the Church of Rome. So that's going to be a big part of what we talk about today, and we'll come back to it next week because it's a very big topic. We'll start with his first wife. I won't go through his childhood and those things because they're not terribly important. We'll start with Catherine, who, of course, we just learned had married Henry's elder brother, Arthur. Now, yes, he was 15 when he died, Arthur, and his death changed history. Because when the father, Henry VII, died in 1502, Arthur was already dead, and Henry now took the throne. Or he became. Oh, sorry, no. Sorry, yes. Sorry. When the brother died at the age of 15. Sorry, I'm getting it a little bit wrong. He was heir to the throne, meaning that he was going to be the next king when his father died. Okay, his father doesn't die quite yet. So when the brother dies, when Arthur dies, Henry is going to be the next king. And Arthur had been married for a few months to Catherine, and then the plan was that after he died, they said, okay, well, she's come all the way from Spain. What are we going to do with her? Should we send her back? No, she can marry the other brother. She can marry Henry. Okay? Well, there were a lot of problems grew up, and it wasn't easy for Henry to marry Catherine. First problem was the dowry. I checked dowry in the translation, and it just said dowry. Okay, in katakana. So I'm not quite sure, but it's money that the woman's family gives to the man, or to the man's family on marriage. Okay, a woman was supposed to give money into the man's family, because from now on the man will pay for and protect and look after the woman, so her family pays a dowry. They pay money to the family of the man. Well, at the time that Arthur died, the money hadn't been paid. Only half of it had been paid. And Henry VII and Catherine's Spanish father were fighting with each other about this money for years. But the plan was that when Henry became 15, when he was old enough, he would marry Catherine. He was only 10 years old at the time, I think, or about 10 years old, something like that. Because, yeah, his elder brother was older, and his future wife was older. She was 5 years older than him. So the plan was for him to wait until he was 15, but there was all this problem about the dowry. And another problem was the fact that, according to the law of the church, you couldn't marry your husband's. Okay, she couldn't marry her husband's brother. Okay, the marrying, it was against the church's law at the time. It came from something in the Bible, a verse in the Bible that says if you marry or you sleep with your your brother's wife. Okay, this would be a terrible thing. You won't have children, and it's a terrible thing. You must never do it. So this meant that the permission of the Romaho, the permission of the Pope, had to be asked in order for Henry to be able to marry Catherine. Well, Catherine herself said, hey, wait a minute, I never really married Arthur anyway. I mean, I married him, but he was just a kid and he was sick. He was sick for months before he died. We never actually slept together. That's what it means when you say the marriage was not consummated. It means they didn't actually sleep together, they didn't actually have sex. Okay, because he was sick and he was unable to. So in that case, it would mean that the marriage never really happened. Okay, so that you wouldn't need permission from the Pope. But Henry said, no, we better get the Pope's permission anyway. Henry Nana said, the father, Henry VII, he said, well, so they got permission from the Pope, and the Pope said, yeah, okay, you can marry Catherine to Henry, the young Henry VIII. So that's supposed to be going ahead, but at the same time, to make things even more complicated, Catherine's mother dies and she has no son. So this is one of the reasons why the dowry was such a problem. Ferdinand is supposed to pay all this money for his daughter, and she is the Princess of Spain. Suddenly the mother dies and there's no son. She's the Princess of Spain now, but when the father dies, if there's no son, she won't be a Princess of Spain anymore because the king will be from another family. So her value on the market goes down. At least that's what Henry VII, that's what he was saying. He's saying, look, why should I pay all this money for her? I mean, she's gone down in the market because her mother's died and there's no son, and your family is not going to be kings in the future. So they were fighting about this. Is there an extra print for the? Yeah, great. There we go. So it's all looking hopeless because the two fathers can't agree, and the dowry's not getting paid properly, and it seems like the marriage isn't going to happen, and then suddenly Henry VII dies. So end of argument. And Henry VIII, the son, he says, I'm going to marry her. All right, so the marriage goes ahead. A couple of months after the death of the father, Henry marries Catherine, Henry VIII. She was quite an extraordinary person. Perhaps Henry knew that she was special because he told everybody, my father, on his deathbed, when he was dying, his last words to me were, marry Catherine. Oh. Okay, before he dropped dead. It doesn't seem very likely that he would have said that because for years he'd been fighting against Henry marrying Catherine. But I think Henry just wanted to get married at this stage, so to push the marriage and to make it support for it stronger, he said that his father had asked him specially, as he was dying, to make sure that he married Catherine. It's quite likely that he just made that up. Okay? But, you know, she was special. When Arthur died, nobody wanted her. Okay, Henry VII. Oh, we've got this Spanish princess. What are we going to do with her? I thought she'd be a good husband for Henry, but he hasn't paid the dowry, and her family back in Spain didn't want her. We're not paying for her. No, nobody seems to want poor Catherine. Okay, she's kept in England. She's almost like a prisoner. She can't get out. She's got no money. Her parents are not sending any money to look after her. She's got to try and figure out her life. Well, she sold off her jewelry. Well, first thing, I got all this expensive jewelry. I don't need that. So she sold that off to get money to live. Clever girl. Practical. And then she was very good at languages and very capable in court, and she became the ambassador. She was the first female ambassador in Europe. Okay, in the early 16th century, it was unheard of for a woman at that time to do that kind of work. She showed herself positive, capable, responsible, organized, understood politics, and not just that, but the Renaissance, the philosophy, the tetsugaku of the Renaissance was humanism. Okay, it's kind of moving away from Christianity and what the Bible says into a more general understanding of human life. And the humanist philosophers, the famous humanist philosophers were Erasmus, Thomas More, Erasmus in Europe, Thomas More in England, and VIII in Spain, although VIII also came to England and spent several years spreading his philosophy and teaching in England. So she was close to those people, they respected her. She could talk their language. I mean their philosophical language, their abstract language. But I also mean their language, which would be Latin. Okay? Latin was the language, the international language of Europe. In those days, the international language was Latin. That's how Germans could speak with English people. That's how Spanish people could speak with French people. They would use Latin. Educated people spoke Latin. All right? So she spoke their language in the sense that she spoke Spanish. Sorry, she did speak Spanish, of course. She was Spanish. She spoke Latin. And she spoke their language in the sense that she could speak at that very high level. She could communicate at a high level of philosophical and political and intellectual discussion. She was a very clever woman. The only weakness that she had, the only mistake she made, is not really her choice. She was not able to have a son. She had a daughter, Mary, who later became queen, but she was not able to have a son. She did not give Henry the son that he wanted. And by the time she was like about 40, Henry started thinking, oh, she's never going to give me a son. And he desperately wanted a son. His idea was, you have to have a strong person on the throne. It has to be a man. They didn't really think that women could do such a thing. Okay? In fact, both of Henry's daughters were strong queens, and his son was weak and died quite young. So Henry got it all wrong, but he was strongly motivated to have a son. And this son that Henry wanted changes the whole of English history. So we typically remember that Henry divorced Catherine. Technically speaking, he didn't divorce her, he annulled the marriage. To annul comes from Latin meaning no, it's sort of like make into nothing. Null is like nothing, and to annul is to make something nothing. So you say, this marriage is not a marriage. It's different from divorce, where you say this marriage now ends. The marriage had a beginning, it has an end, and they separate. You annul it, you say, it never was a marriage. It never existed. It was a mistake. It should never have happened. It's not a proper marriage. Okay? So technically, Henry did not divorce Catherine. Technically, the marriage was made into nothing. The marriage was annulled. And it caused huge problems and had a tremendous effect on the country. By the time she was 40 in 1525, and Henry realized that she wasn't going to have a son, he started an affair. Well, he'd had quite a lot of affairs, but he had quite a big affair with Mary Boleyn, and then a couple of years later, Mary's sister Anne. Now, unlike Henry's other mistresses, Anne said, no, 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 I'm not going to go to bed with you. No, 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 it's marriage or nothing. All right? She was not going to play the game of being his IG, his lover. She was going to marry him or nothing else. And so this is when Henry starts to get serious and say, let's annul the marriage. Let's put an end to the marriage. Finish it. Not even finish it, but just say it never was a marriage. This marriage is a mistake. It should never have happened. He tried to use the words of the Bible, the same words that were in the church. The church said you must never marry your brother's wife, because if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath is just the old word for has. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. So it's written in the Bible, church law was you can't marry your brother's wife. All right? So he went to the Pope and said, can you give us special permission? And the Pope said, yeah, sure. He's dead anyway. And Catherine says she never slept with him. They never went to bed together. They never had sex. So, yeah, sure. You have special permission. Now Henry comes back and says, yes, but the Bible says, look, I haven't had a son, you see. It's true. They shall be childless. Of course, he did have a daughter, but for him that wasn't what he wanted. So he went back to the Pope saying, hola, this marriage should never have happened. It was a mistake. It's against God's law. I'm asking you now, as the Pope, to say that this marriage is finished. Right? Over. And not just finished and over, as I say, but never really was a marriage. Well, he thought the Pope was going to say yes, but the Pope did not say yes. Against his expectations, the Pope did not agree and would not annul the marriage. And he said that the verse in Leviticus is only if the brother is still alive. Once the brother's dead, that rule doesn't apply. And the Pope is right. Okay, we'll talk about why the Pope was right later on, but the Bible does say that if the brother is dead, then you should take his wife. Okay, so it's only when he's alive that this rule applies. Once he's dead, that's a completely different thing. And Catherine is continuing to say that she never slept with him anyway. So Henry now has to go against the Pope. Yeah, and the Pope is friendly with Catherine's parents. Catherine's father, at least. The mother's died. So he's not going to say yes. So Henry now has to go against the Pope in order to separate from Catherine. So instead of getting permission from the Pope, he just said, well, the English law will be enough. Just use the law of this country. So he got a court, and the court agreed. To be honest, you didn't have much choice with Henry VIII. Because if you disagreed, he'd chop your head off. So Oh yes, Henry. Yeah. Whatever you say, Henry. Yes. Yes. You should never have been married to her. It's against the church law, and your marriage to Catherine is nothing. Okay, because they didn't want to get their heads chopped off. Okay, this was the same for anybody in England at that time. Henry was uniquely powerful, and he'd already gone through a marriage ceremony with Anne, and the marriage was declared valid in May of 1533, and then basically the Pope issued a bull of excommunication. Ex meaning out, and communication finish. Okay, you cannot communicate. You are not part of the church. You are outside the church. Tobash sareteru. Okay, you're kicked out of the church. All right. So Henry is now outside the Catholic Church. And then the next year, he passes a new law, the Act of Supremacy, in which he says, okay, I am now the head of the Church of England. I am the leader of the church in this country. Okay? It's kind of... If you have a problem with the Pope, you just say, forget the Pope. I'm the boss here. I'll make my own rules. Okay? Pope kicks me out, says I'm not in the Catholic Church anymore. Okay, so I'll make my own church. And the Eikoku Kyokai will be separate from the Church of Rome, and I'll be the leader of it. Okay? So he changes the religion of the whole country just because he wants to separate from Catherine. Okay? I think we call that wagamama. Really. But basically that's what happened. And that was why England, in the very beginning, that's why England stopped being a Catholic church. Because the Catholic Church, you have to follow the Pope. So if they don't follow the Pope, it's not Catholic. So England, the Church of England, is now separate from the Catholic Church. So let's look at the way that the annulment of the marriage leads to breaking with Rome, separating from the church. At the same time as Henry is having this kenka, this argument with the Pope, Europe is going through a big process of disagreeing with the Catholic Church. So Martin Luther in Germany, very famously, in which year? 1517. Please notice it is now 2117. Sorry, it's now 2017. It is exactly 500 years since Luther started the Protestant Reform movement. This is the 500th year of Protestant reform. So Martin Luther famously pinned his theses, his ideas about the church, his arguments against the church on the door of the church in Wittenberg, and well, that's what he's supposed to have done, and this started the movement of Protestant reform. So inside Henry having his kind of breakup with the Pope and his break with Rome, in Europe you've got whole countries that are also breaking with Rome, but not because they want to get married to somebody else, okay, but because they disagree with the teachings of the church. Okay, they say, Katoliku kyokai ga machigatteru. Honto no seisho no kotoba wa chigaimasu. Okay, there's a difference between what the Bible says and what the church says. That's basically what Luther was arguing about, that the church and the Bible are not in agreement. And so Luther was, he was a Catholic, he was a monk. He wanted the church to say, oh, I saw this, yeah, you're right. Let's change the church and make the church more in agreement with the Bible. Instead of that, they said, Luther, you're out. Okay? You're excommunicated. And everybody who agrees with Luther, you're out. So they made their own separate churches. This is the Reformation. This is where the church divides from being one Catholic church into being Catholic and Protestant. And it's one of the very, very big things that happens during this early modern period. So we'll have to talk about it more later on. It's a big thing. Now, Henry didn't agree with the Protestant reformers. Henry didn't agree with Luther. All he wanted was to end his marriage with Catherine. But basically, he agreed with the Catholic thinking. He wasn't a Protestant. Okay? He was just having a kink out with the Pope, an argument with the Pope, a disagreement with the Pope, for a completely different reason. Just because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn and separate from Catherine. In fact, he had been given a special title, Fidei Defensor, means defender of the faith. It means, protector of Catholico Mamota, Mamoru Tame, Catholico no Shukyo. In order to protect the Catherine and defend the Catholic religion, he published a book against Luther in 1521, and he was given a special title by the Pope as a defender of the faith, a defender of the Catholic religion. He was very much against Luther. So it's a big mistake to think that when England became separate from the Church of Rome, that England was becoming Protestant. England was not becoming Protestant at that time. The Protestant churches of Europe were very different from England at this time. But それは難しい話だから後でもっと詳しい説明します。We'll talk about that later on. But because Henry did break with Rome, of course at that time everyone, oh, you break with Rome, you must be a Protestant. And Henry said, no, I'm not a Protestant, I hate the Protestants, I disagree with the Protestants, I'm not with the Protestants. They said, but you've broken with Rome, you've got to be with somebody. Okay, you can't just be on your own like that. Who's going to support you? The Catholics won't support you if you break with Rome, if you break with the Pope. If you want supporters, if you want somebody to support you, you've got to agree with somebody. So, ちょっと妥協して, he made a few compromises and introduced one or two kind of Protestant type ideas. All right. The first big compromise was to allow the Bible to be translated into English. Just a few years before that, there had been a translation of the Bible into English, and Henry had punished the translator by burning him to death. But now he said, okay, let's have the Bible in English. Here's the poor man, William Tyndale. He was burned for translating the Bible into English. His dying words were, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Open his eyes, meaning make the king see the truth, make the king understand the truth. The truth is that we need to translate the Bible. Translate the Bible. From what language? That's right, Latin. Translate the Bible from Latin into the common language of the people. The language, in Germany, they would translate the Bible into German. In France, they translated it into French. In England, they were translating it into English. Tyndale was the leader of a little group of people who were translating it. He did much of it himself. and korosareta. Okay, he was punished, he was burned to death by Henry for translating the Bible into English. Why do you think the Protestants wanted to translate the Bible into English or the everyday language of people? Why did they want to do it?
Like all understand it.
Exactly, so that everybody could understand it. If it was in Latin, only the very educated people could understand it. Most ordinary people didn't understand much Latin. They might understand a bit. They went to the church every week, and you know, some of them went every day, and everything was in Latin. So they probably understood something, but they couldn't understand it in real detail. And they had translated a couple of hundred years before, in the Middle Ages, somebody had tried to translate the Bible into English, and it almost led to a kakume, a revolution. And so after that, it was kinshi, it was forbidden in England to translate the Bible into English. And Henry followed that idea. If you translate the Bible into English, people will read it and they'll say, wait a minute, that's different from what the church is telling us to do, and that's different. Wait a minute here, no, wait a minute, where's my gun? Okay, I want to kill someone because they're telling me things that are not in the Bible. Okay, and they're taking my money, and they are controlling my life, but it's not in the Bible. All right. And of course, the church and the government were close together. And in some ways, yes, they were tricking the people. So that's why it was a big political thing to translate the Bible into English. But in the end, Henry had to say, okay, Germany's doing it, France is doing it, other countries are doing it. Let's translate the Bible into English. So poor Tyndale was put to death in 1536, and then 3 years later, his Bible was published, mostly his. Okay, a guy called Coverdale made some changes and translated one or two bits that Tyndale didn't translate, but mostly it was Tyndale's translation. And again, his translation of the Bible is a very, very important piece of work for the English language, because when you translate, you choose words. He didn't choose the more Latin words, he chose the more Saxon words. And the language that Shakespeare used is because of Tyndale. Tyndaleが存在しなかったら、Shakespeare はそのように書けなかった。Okay, if it hadn't been for Tyndale, we couldn't have Shakespeare. So Tyndale helped to shape the English language of this time, as well as translating the religion and the Bible. He also shaped the English language. So it's a very important translation. The monasteries where the monks and the convent was for women, okay, shisuta, and the monasteries for men. And for hundreds of years, these had been religious institutions. And this is the other big, in addition to allowing the translation of the Bible, the big thing that he did, the second big thing that he did was to allow or not just to allow, but to force the monasteries to close down. In one of Shakespeare's sonnets, he talks about bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, and he's talking about, saikin made kirei na uta ga demashita kedo ima subete kuwashiteru. Okay, he's talking about the monasteries. And this was something that Henry was very happy to do because he got a lot of money out of it. He could sell the land. As soon as the monasteries were destroyed or closed, he took possession of the land, and then he sold that land off to get money to pay for his wars. And the monks and nuns themselves, well, they quite a lot of them left England, but many stayed behind, getting a pension, a kind of nenkin, as compensation for losing their position in the monastery. they could also, the men at least, they could join, they could become Shimpusama or something like that. They could join the church in another way. And they weren't allowed to marry, even though the monasteries had been closed and they weren't monks anymore, they were still not allowed to marry until after Henry died. The buildings themselves were mainly either destroyed or else they were just left to ruin themselves over the years. And you can see, I'm sorry, I just went into Google and took some pictures of monasteries, and afterwards I thought they're not all actually English, but these are the monasteries, and many of them are English, but some of them are not. So this is an English monastery, and this is Shakespeare's famous bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. What he means is that inside those ruined buildings of the monasteries, there used to be beautiful kamisama no uta, there used to be a wonderful culture, and because of Henry, it's all gone. So here we can see a number of them. As I say, they're not all English. Okay. You can still see these ruins across the English countryside today. These ruined monasteries. All over the country. Many of them are still there. Sometimes you go, yeah, there's nothing, it's completely gone. But there is still enough standing that you can quite frequently find them in various parts of England. And again, in Henry's play about Henry Hasse, he says, those that can pity here may, if they think it well, let forth a tear. Okay? If you're able to feel sad, you should feel sad about this. Okay? Now, it's especially a good time to think about that because one of the Jesuskai from this university published several books, and a lot of books, arguing that Shakespeare was a Catholic. I don't agree. Okay, I think Shakespeare was probably not a Catholic, but Father Peter Millwood argued that Shakespeare was a Catholic, and Father Peter Millwood died a few weeks ago. So if you want to know about the culture of this university, one of the things that Sophia University is famous for is Peter Millwood. And one of the things that and the main thing that Peter Millwood is famous for is the argument that Shakespeare was a Catholic. You Google him up, you'll find he comes up lots of times. Okay, he's one of the most famous scholars of Sophia University, and he died just a few weeks ago. So the idea that Shakespeare was a Catholic because he wrote these lines saying, Zang Nengdes, the monasteries, the Shodoing, are being closed down, and it's a terrible shame. But on the other hand, the convents and monasteries, many of them were corrupt. They were not pure places. They were like late at night they would be singing, but it wouldn't be shukyo no uta. They'd be singing rude songs and they'd be drinking alcohol. And although the monastery was only for men, they'd have a back door and women would get in, and they'd be sort of orgiastic parties, and all sorts of naughty things were going on. It wasn't as pure as it was meant to be. So there were quite a lot of criticisms. Not all of the monasteries were kind of corrupt in that way, but there were quite a lot of criticisms about the monasteries. So a lot of people felt, those men and women, they have an easy life. They don't have to work like we do. The church protects them until they die. They get food, and they're not supposed to get women, the men, but secretly they do. And the women too. How many of them have had babies that have been secretly hidden somewhere. Okay, they don't really live the religious pure life that they're supposed to. So there was a criticism from that side. But again, it's a difficult balance. So we'll also see that these monasteries and convents were responsible for education, for charity, for health. And when they were gone, there were big social problems after they were gone, because who is now responsible for education? Who is now responsible for hospitals and health? Who is now responsible for charity for the poor? Nobody. Okay, so there were big social problems after they were closed as well. So mixed feelings about the monasteries. And then, of course, Henry's wives. All of that trouble caused just because Henry wanted to separate from Catherine and marry Anne. And then what happened? 3 years later, he chopped her head off. Yeah, grisly business. Why did he chop her head off? Probably the main reason was because she didn't have the son that he wanted. She had a daughter who went on to be Queen Elizabeth, but she didn't have a son, and Henry desperately wanted a son. Also, maybe when he was married to her, she wasn't quite so sexy and so much fun as she was when he actually married to her. It was a different relationship. He got tired of it. He got bored. Also, she was much more Protestant than he was. And that possibly got her into trouble. We don't know exactly what was going on. But he didn't say, I'm tired of her. He didn't say, oh, she hasn't given me a son. He didn't say, oh, she's too Protestant. He said, she's sleeping with other men. Even her own brother. She sleeps with her own brother. What a dirty, terrible woman. And he had her put to death for that. Okay, that's probably not. She'd have to be very stupid, really. I mean, knowing what Henry was like. She probably was not sleeping with other men. Okay? But Henry probably wanted to get rid of those men, and it was a convenient way. Get rid of my wife and get rid of those men as a bonus. Kill them all. Okay? That's what he was like. Nasty. Okay? So that's what happened. He got rid of his political enemies at the same time as getting rid of his wife. And that was pretty much 3 years after she became queen. So we call her Anne of 1,000 Days. Okay, I don't know if you've heard. There's several movies and things about her, and Anne of 1,000 Days is one of the sort of romantic names that she's given. So then he married Jane Seymour and got the son that he wanted, but unfortunately Jane herself died, probably because of the complications of having the child. So many children died in childbirth. And quite often it was a big risk for the mother as well to have a child. And it seems that Jane died because of complications after after giving birth to the child. So he got his son, but his wife was dead. So his advisor recommended a German princess. And she came all the way over from Germany. Henry took one look at it and said, oh my God. So the marriage took place, but he never actually slept with her, and a few months later they said this marriage is annulled. So that's the end of her. She goes back to Germany. And then he marries Catherine Howard, who's another of these, like Anne Boleyn herself, she's another kind of lady-in-waiting is a kind of high-class Titsadai-sama for the king. All right? They often came from very high-class families, but she's English. And so was Anne Boleyn. And he couldn't chop the heads off Spanish princesses or German princesses because it would be war. Okay? The ones he chopped the heads off were English. Okay? And the unfortunate Catherine Howard. So that's the fifth wife. And then finally, Catherine Parr, she outlived him. He died before she did. So there's a little way of remembering the marriages, okay? Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Okay? That's a little way that school children remember the marriages. Okay, well that's about it then, really. We'll come back and look at the religious aspects of the Reformation and why that was so important to people and people's lives in those days. We'll talk about that next week. But for this week, basically, we've finished. There they are, the 6 wives. And remember, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Okay? All right then, enjoy this. That's everything for today.